Hey everyone, Chris Clark here from PalmettoPreps.com. Today, I'm going to show you some video from the August 10th Executive Committee, a couple appeals that were on the docket. I'm going to show you the agenda here. This video is going to be courtesy of the South Carolina High School League. Here you see the agenda that was sent out for the August 10th meeting. There's a withdrawn proposal from Lexington County, within a Greenville County School District suspension of in-person workouts, and a Greer Middle College Charter High School age rule. So this video, I think, is about 50 minutes or so. If you want to check out what the panel talked about during their Zoom meeting, you can see it here on PalmettoPreps.com. Again, this video courtesy of the South Carolina High School League. So please enjoy. Make sure you're checking out PalmettoPreps.com for South Carolina High School football and recruiting news. Lots of stuff to get to this football season. If you don't mind, like this video, subscribe to our channel. It's free, helps us grow, helps push this video out to more people and all our high school football content here in South Carolina. And if you feel like, drop a comment. Appreciate it. And we'll see you on PalmettoPreps.com, and enjoy this video from South Carolina High School League.
School League appellate panel. Before we get started, we need to approve the minutes from the last meeting. If everybody's had a chance to review those. We get a motion to approve.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir.
Before we motion, there's no discussion in the minutes about previous discussions we had to the meeting and the presentation by Lexington last week about us not having the information available or sent to us by the high school league on either the high school league plan or the Lexington plan. I think we all said that none of us received it. Make sure that that was in the minutes, that we received all information, pertinent information relative to each appeal for discussion purposes.
Okay.
I'd like the minutes to reflect those discussions.
All right. We have a motion to adjust the minutes. Do we have a second?
A second.
All right. So do a roll call, please.
All right. Mr. McCall?
Yes.
Mr. Rawl?
Yes.
Mr. Twido?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
You're
You're
muted.
muted, Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Mr. Queen
Yes.
and Mr. King.
Yes.
6 are all in favor.
In favor, so the motion passed to add Mr. Rawls' request to the meeting minutes about receiving information prior to meetings. So after that, we're going to move forward. First off, I just want to say good morning. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If you're not speaking, please try to keep your computer muted. So try to prohibit any background noise through these Zoom meetings so no one's interrupted. We have 3 items on the agenda this morning. First item was the Lexington County School District, and they have submitted in writing their desire to withdraw their appeal. So by my understanding, no action needs to be taken. I just want to thank Lexington for, bringing some of their ideas to the table. I still think they had a lot of compassion in what they did, and it's still going to help the high school league moving forward and making sure that they recognize all the concerns in the state. So secondly, move on to the second item. We have Greenville County School District. You ready to bring them in?
Yes, I will bring those in.
Let me know when they're ready.
All right. Greenville County, just want to make sure you're all with us. Scott Reimer,
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Daryl Nance,
Here.
and Burt Royster.
Yes, I'm here.
Greenville is all present.
Thank you. Good morning. Appreciate you guys coming to present to us this morning. Before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the appellate panel. We have Mr. Raleigh King. He represents the 6th Congressional District. Mr. Jackie Queen represents the 5th Congressional District. Mr. Bob Davis represents the 4th Congressional District. Mr. Andy Twido represents the 3rd Congressional District. Mr. Otis Rawl represents the 2nd Congressional District. I'm Bill McCall. I represent the 1st Congressional District. For the record, can you all please state your names again and who's presenting?
Yes, thank you for hearing our appeal this morning. I'm Burke Royster. I'm Superintendent of Greenville County Schools. I will present, but also have on the Zoom with me Scott Reimer, who's the Assistant Superintendent for High School Leadership for Greenville County Schools, and Daryl Nance, who's the District Athletic Director. I may call on them to provide some information, or certainly you may have some questions you want to ask of them, but I'll do the initial presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
So before we begin, I need to read the following statement. In accordance with the Freedom of Information Act, the High School League posted and provided notices of the hearing and stated agenda. A copy of the notice will be attached to the minutes of the meeting. Pursuant to South Carolina Code Section 30-4-60, every meeting of all public bodies shall be open to the public unless one of the criteria delineated in South Carolina Code 30-4-70 is at issue. Unless the facts and evidence presented in this appeal involve any discussion of employment, appointment, compensation, promotion, demotion, or release of an employee, a student or person regulated by a public body, or the appointment of a person to a public office, this hearing shall proceed in public view of those in attendance and this public hearing. At this time, do you wish to proceed in open or closed session?
Is that question?
Yes, sir. You want to go open or close?
I don't know of anything in here that would be closed session material, so we would say open session.
Okay. So before we proceed any further, I'm just going to ask you to please state what your appeal request is.
Yes, sir. We submitted a proposal to the League Executive Committee on July the 2nd, requesting that the League take a stand regarding the continuation or not of, at that time, athletic conditioning, based on having a percentage of school districts in the state that had ended conditioning due to the rate of the COVID spread in their community.
Okay.
I'll assume, and maybe I shouldn't, so I'll ask it, that you all have a copy of the actual letter that was submitted on July the 2nd that outlines the proposal. You all have that?
I believe it was in that Dropbox. We're thinking of the same one.
It's a little over 2-page letter, 2 pages, 1 paragraph. It outlines a proposal. The first probably 2 to 3 paragraphs talks about the DHEC matrix that they established to identify and rate the level of spread by county in the state, using the incidence rate per 100,000 people, the trend in the incidence rate, and the percent of positive tests as a proportion of the whole number of individuals tested, with each person counting only 1 time. Do you all have that information in front of you?
Yes, it was in the Dropbox, so we're good. We'll get that. We'll get to your appeal in just a minute.
Okay.
Well, I appreciate that. So you're making the same appeal that you made to the High School League Executive Committee?
Well, basically, it was a direct request to them to establish a cutoff, and we suggested and submitted when 15% of the state, basing that on 15% of the student population in the state, if districts that comprised 15% or more of that population ceased activities.
Right. Mr. Royster, we'll get to your presentation. I just want to know, are there any changes that to this appeal today versus what you appealed to the executive committee?
I'm sorry, I guess I don't understand your question.
Okay, well, did y'all appeal to the executive committee, correct?
Well, it was submitted directly to the executive committee, yes, sir. Through the commissioner.
Right, okay. Well, what you're going to present to us today, are there any differences between what you submitted to the executive committee versus what you're bringing to the appellate panel today?
No, sir, I don't think there are any differences to it. There's some areas that even when we presented it to them, it was suggested at a level as opposed to a required level, but that wouldn't be any different.
All right, thank you.
Yes, sir.
All right, are there any members of the appellate panel feel like they need to excuse themselves from this vote? There's none. So if there are no questions, then I'll go ahead and let you make your presentation. Mr. Royster, please try to keep it around 10 minutes to give us time to ask any questions. You can begin.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Yes. Really, the presentation is quite simply, as I had summarized earlier in response to one of your questions, we put forth a proposal to the executive committee that when a number of school districts in the state that represented 15% or more of the state's population ended, at that time it was conditioning, we would propose at whatever level of activity was taking place. When that number of school districts that reflected 15% of the population or more had ceased activity, that the league would then act to cease activities throughout the state. And we're not wedded to 15%. We simply put that in there as a suggestion. Really what we wanted the league to do was take a position based on their discussion, their analysis, that when a percent of school districts shut down, the league would then act to shut down athletics all over the state. The belief being that if you continue in some areas of the state, you're gaining an unfair competitive advantage when you're not able to continue in other areas of the state. Again, nothing magical about 15%. Our school district reflects 10% of the population of the state. At the time that we submitted this proposal, there were probably a sufficient number of school districts in the state that had ended the conditioning they were doing that would reflect 250,000 or more students in the state of South Carolina. That's a pretty significant number. There's over 700,000 public school students. Didn't have the eligibility numbers to base it on eligibility, so we simply based it on the population of the districts in the counties that at that time had ended their conditioning activities. One of the discussions that we heard from the executive committee was that conditioning did not present an advantage. I would simply say two things in response to that. I believe that any opportunity for athletes to work with a coach is an advantage to that athlete and to that team. I believe the time spent with coaches is certainly very advantageous to athletes. So I would say that it does present an advantage. The second thing I would say is it was not the intent of the proposal to simply apply to conditioning, but to apply to whatever status that athletic teams were involved in at the time. So at this point, it could be, I believe they refer to it as phase 1.5, phase 2, whatever phase we happen to be in. If throughout our state there was a significant number, again, that could have been 15%, it could be 20%, might decide it ought to be 25% or 30%. At what point does that trigger the league to act and say we need to suspend what's going on throughout the state because there is such a significant number of student athletes that have been affected by the fact that their individual districts have suspended interaction for athletics. At whatever point in the process we might be, that might be conditioning, it might be practice, it might be the ability to scrimmage, it might be during the actual playing season. I just believe that, and we believe that there should be, based on objective criteria, a point in time when the league acts and says, we need to stop this, we need to pause this, we need to suspend that at this point. Again, that point could be 15%, could be 20%, could be 25%, could be 30%. But in reviewing that request, the executive committee decided that was not something they wanted to do. It was a little bit concerning that some of the discussion centered around the fact that we had never done anything in the past when we had issues like hurricanes. Well, I'm not sure that we ought to make every decision for the present and the future based on the past. I do believe that some years ago, when Hugo hit, that there were some changes made and some decisions made related to the season. And I think there've probably been some since then. But I'm not sure that's a really good measure of standard for approving or disapproving a proposal related to what's probably the most unusual condition that we've experienced that's affected the public since probably the Great Depression and World War II. So that certainly the gist of what we proposed. You have the details in writing in front of you. I believe that fairly succinctly summarizes it. Certainly be glad to answer any questions that any member of the appellate committee has for us.
Bill, we can't
Bill,
hear
you're
you.
muted.
There we
Bill,
go.
you're muted.
Thank you.
Sorry. Mr. Royster, are you through? You had a chance to present everything?
Yes, certainly be glad to answer any questions that you all might have.
Well, I'm going to open it up to questions from the appellate panel. Mr. King, do you have any questions for the presenters?
No, he explained it very well.
All right, thank you. Mr. Queen?
No, sir, I understand.
Thank you. Mr. Davis?
No, I understand. I have no questions.
Thank you. Mr. Twido?
I have a couple of questions.
Go ahead.
What is determined in Greenville County that as the decision to keep your district closed athletically?
I'm sorry, Coach, could you repeat that? I didn't hear the very first part of it.
What determined the Greenville County schools keeping their athletic training part closed for most of the summer?
Okay, we had conditioning underway when the number of cases skyrocketed. In fact, when I sent this proposal in, we were unfortunately leading the state in the number of identified cases. The percentage of cases among young people in the age group 11 to 21, the week preceding the submission of this, that had increased by 1,000%. So it was the large increase, the very dramatic increase, increases that we experienced both 2 weeks after Memorial Day in that length of time, and then 2 weeks after the 4th of July, we again experienced another bump. We have since reinstated, beginning today, conditioning. And again, at that same time that we submitted this, I believe Charleston County, Horry County, Richland 1, Richland 2, Lexington 1, probably about 250,000 students or better represented by those school districts made that same decision. But it had to do with going back and looking at the matrix that was developed by DHEC related to spread.
Okay, and you've kind of answered my second question on why you decided to open today.
Yes, sir. If you look back over 3 weeks, the DHEC matrix is a 2-week look back.
Okay.
And every week they add a new week and drop the older week, but it's still a 2-week look back. So if you go to the last 3 weeks, what you will find in Greenville County is a decline in the rate per 100,000, which is one of the 3 measures. You'll see a decline in the percent positive, which is second of the 3 measures. And the third measure is really a trend data that looks at those 2 and shows it as either being increasing, stable, or decreasing. And fortunately, in Greenville County in the last 3 weeks, it has gone from increasing to stable to decreasing. Now, it would still be rated as high. When you look at DHEC provides in the first two categories I mentioned, low, medium, and high. We still rate as high in those two categories, but the trend is in the right direction, moving down per 100,000. It's moving down in percent of positive, and that caused us to reinstate what we're doing.
And one more, and I think you addressed this already, but I just want to make sure I heard correctly. Does the number of students in Greenville County make up 10% of the school population in the state?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Thank you. Mr. Rawl, you have any questions?
No questions.
All right. Any more questions from the panel to the presenters before we move on? All right, hearing none. We're going to open it up now and let the league respond. Jerome, who's presenting today for the league?
Mr. Montgomery.
Okay. When you're ready, Mr. Montgomery.
Thank you. Good morning. Good to see everybody. I'll just make a few comments initially, and then Mr. Singleton can chime in as necessary. Obviously, as Dr. Royster had noted, the executive committee vote, I do want to sort of mention that one of the things that they did seem to focus on was that having an automatic cutoff, or at that time completely shutting it down, would take away the options from local school districts and local superintendents. And certainly that was a big concern. I think the task force that the league had to come up with recommendations for workouts and for the season did not include this. And I think the executive committee put some deference to that task force that had looked at a lot of data and a lot of things in coming up with their recommendations. I think the other concern that you would see with having some cutoff would be that it really could prevent a lot of students from participating and taking away that decision from local districts. I would say the low risk sports, the proposal that has been brought forward would apply to all sports. So if you have some low risk sports that may be able to participate with precautions, if you have a percentage of the overall population, then this proposal shuts down sports across the board. I think that's a concern as well. And I guess in preparing for today and sort of trying to make sure we understood the population numbers that we were looking at, and I think from what Dr. Royster has said would be 15% of the student population, which is roughly 750,000 students statewide. 15% of that number is 112,500 students. And if the top two districts, Greenville County and Charleston County, were to shut down operations, that would shut it down for the entire state. And it would not apply differently to sports, whether it's low risk sports versus high risk sports. And so I think while in theory, if we're looking at a cutoff, I think we have to be very careful not to be overly broad with the numbers we look at. And I think the committee did not want to get into the business of taking away decisions from local school districts as to whether they would continue some sports or they would continue all sports, or it would just be workouts or practices or whatever it may be. And so I think that was the executive committee's reason for voting the proposal down. And I think the possibility here with, if we're looking at student population in a certain percentage and that cutoff, I think the 15%, and whether that increases some or not, we still have a considerable risk to prevent students from playing when they may otherwise be able to, or just given the size of some of our the top five, I think the top 5 school districts in our state, that student population is about 235,000 students. So even if you went, up to 30%, the top 5 districts could theoretically determine what happens in all 80 school districts. So I think that's the concern with having some arbitrary cutoff or some number cutoff based on student population, given the concentration of some of where our students are and the type of sports that we wish to play, some being high risk, some being low risk. So I'll let Mr. Singleton fill in any gaps, but I want to at least say I think that was a big concern for the committee. It was, you know, as Dr. Royster said, it was based on the condition that sort of existed back in early July. And as things change, you know, the league, I know, intends to be flexible to, if we have certain spikes or if things progress, to look at these things. But having a cutoff in place now really would, I think, hamstring not only the league, but also local districts.
That addressed it.
All right, you through, Michael? You presented it?
Yep. We'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Mr. King, you have any questions for the league?
No, I don't have any questions.
Mr. Queen?
I would just like to know if the league has considered anything of this nature, not necessarily a certain number, but is there a point, whether coming from DHEC, coming from the State Department of Education, or even the governor's office, that athletics would be shut down? All athletics, not just one sport.
And I'll have to defer to Mr. Singleton on that. I think as everyone is well aware, we are in uncharted territories. And so I think as data changes, as information comes in, as we see what happens when students are going back to school on some basis, or these preseason practices and contests begin, certainly the league will be watching that closely. But to say there's been a data point set now where everything would be shut down regardless of the sport, I have not sat in on the task force discussion, so I can't answer that personally. But I think it would certainly be something that would be continually looked at with the input from the superintendents and from stakeholders around the state.
Yes, we're constantly in conversation with DHEC. Actually, I have a meeting scheduled with them again tomorrow. Constantly in conversation with the Sports Medicine Advisory Committee. I've had conversation constantly with representatives from the governor's office. None of them have come out and said, actually, we need to shut down sports. None of them come forward and said, this needs to be shut down. They all speak to the risk that would be involved. They all speak to being cautious and making decisions about how we will move forward. So those are the type of things that we're looking at. So there's been no directive or any small consideration from any of those groups I just mentioned that says that we need to shut down all sports, all high school.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Davis, you have any questions for the league?
No, not at me.
Mr. Twito, do you have any questions?
No.
All right, thank you. Mr. Raw?
Just one question, Mr. Chair, Ms. Royster. Ms. Royster, I understand that it's a district's prerogative to decide whether or not they want to continue athletic activities in your district. If this appeal doesn't come out your way, what position do you, as the leader of Greenville County Schools with about 70,000 kids, what do you do? Do you move forward with the high school league proposal, or do you shut down sports based on what you believe is the right thing to do right now?
Mr. Raw, I think in response to your question, we have to ask ourselves the question, if we decide it's not safe for students to be in school in person, we have several options to how we do that in our district. 1 day, 2 days, up to 5 days. We decide it's not safe for them to be in school in person, for them or for our employees. be hard pressed to say it would be safe for them to be participating in athletics in person. It's our desire that students be in school when it's safe for them to be there and for our employees. If the trend continues that's been established in the last 3 weeks in Greenville County, and we'll get a report from DHEC sometime today, hopefully sooner rather than later, but generally it comes at the end of the day on Monday. If that trend continues in a positive way, it will be our intent to open school 2 weeks from today on a 1. In our plan, that is students come in 1 day in person. And we have a Monday group, Tuesday group, Wednesday group, Thursday group, and you do virtual the rest of the time. Athletics is extremely important. I've supported athletics, been involved in it my entire professional career. It provides great opportunities for young people. It does things for them that that quite honestly probably wouldn't be done for them in other ways. It is, to quote John Carlisle, the most cost-effective at-risk program that we operate. It's a difficult decision to make, just like it's an extremely difficult decision to make whether to bring students back into our building. At the end of the day, the decision we have to make is what's safest for everybody involved.
I don't want to put you on the spot, so based on the information you got today, what's the safest position to put your student athletes in right now in your judgment?
Right now, we're allowing them to return to conditioning today, assuming that we do not get different news today from DHEC that we got from the last 3 reports. They would continue in that mode and move forward so long as we have students in school. And it would be our intent, if we get a good report from DHEC today, in other words, trending the same way it was trending or stable, that we'll open school with 1 day in person, and we will continue athletics so long as that's the case. If we have to close school, we have to say that it's not safe for you to be there in a very controlled way where we can keep people 6 feet apart, then I think we got to seriously review what we do with athletics. And I also believe that goes back to what we proposed. I think when a sufficient number of school districts have had to make that difficult choice, then I guess we might have to agree to disagree with the league. I think at that point, the league needs to step in and make the decision. And I know there are 80, I believe now 80 school districts, perhaps 79. There have been some consolidations. But I think you do have to look at the number of total students involved, because it also translates into the number of total athletes involved. Again, there's nothing magic about 15%. I don't have a particular tie to that. That's what I put in there. 20%, 25%, 30%, 35%. But I do believe there needs to be a point where the league says enough of you have stopped what you're doing that we need to stop throughout the state, because at that point it does become a competitive advantage.
Mr. Chair, can I ask Michael or Jerome a question right quick?
Yeah, please.
The question would be, if Greenville School District, Consolidated School District, which I think's got 16, 17 different athletic programs, schools and all, if they decide not to participate, or other districts decide not to participate, what impact does that have on scheduling, classification, all the different things that go into opening a football season? I think sometime in the end of September right now, 1st of October, depending on what the extension does. What does the high school league do if Greenville school districts decide to not participate?
The executive committee made a decision last week that there will be no penalties, no financial penalties to any school that choose not to play. So when we're talking about not participating, are we talking about selected sports? Are we talking about all sports? All those things will make a difference. Currently, our state constitution says that if 16 schools offer a sport, we can offer a state championship. It only requires 16. schools are doing. Now, if we want to look at that, at playoffs and championships in classification, it requires that they have a minimum of 12. So as far as who, what your classification looks like or what region contest, we've left those things at the discretion of the region to determine how they would view any games that are not played by all schools within the region, especially those sports that require region play or have traditionally used region play to determine playoff purposes. Outside of that, it becomes a very local decision. The exec committee was very strong in making the statement that there should be no penalties to any school, financially anyways, that chooses not to play, which means that we will not enforce any contracts that were drawn up between schools.
Thank you, sir.
And just to maybe add to that, I think just because there is no set percentage cutoff at this point doesn't mean that the league would not step in when schools are determining whether to go back, how preseason practices start, how the contests start. And I think that's the concern piece that I would raise at the point of setting some percentage before the schools go back with preseason practices, continuing conditioning, and that will continually be looked at as we get feedback from schools, classifications, districts, and so forth.
Thank you.
Any more questions from the panel for the high school league? Okay, hearing none, let's let me see. Do we have a motion?
Mr. Chair, I make a motion that we support the executive committee's decision. And the reason for that is, based on Mr. Royster's testimony, he has opened it up to his schools to practice just like every other school in the state. I think the district, the high school league has a plan, not sure exactly what they're using as a matrix to decide, but right now, because all schools opened up and Greenville's participating just like every other school district, would be my reason for let's move forward with the executive committee's plan forward.
All right, so we have a motion to uphold the executive committee's decision, open it up for discussion. Anybody have anything they'd like to add?
Probably need a second on that, Mr. Chair.
Okay, do I have a second?
I'll second that.
Okay. Anybody have anything else they'd like to add? All right, hearing none, the motion on the floor is to uphold the executive committee's decision, and we have a second. I think we're ready to get a roll call.
Okay, Mr. McCall,
But hold on, before you start, saying yes means we're agreeing to uphold the executive committee, and no means the overturn it, correct?
correct.
Okay, go ahead.
Mr. McCall,
Yes.
Mr. Rawl,
Yes.
Mr. Twido,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mr. Queen,
Yes.
and Mr. King.
Yes.
I have 6 in favor, 0 opposed.
Okay, so the decision was made to uphold the executive committee's decision. So that's what that means. Mr. Royster, I appreciate you guys coming today and presenting your appeal to us. Thank you.
Thank you for your time and hearing our appeal.
Yes, sir. All right, we got one more item on the agenda. We're ready to bring them in.
Yes, we are. I'll start admitting them now.
All right, Greer Middle College. I appreciate you guys.
Mr. Crawford, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Mr. Owens?
Yes.
Okay, and then do I also have the parents, the Rainies?
Just the dad.
Okay, all right. So Mr. McCall, we do have Greer Middle College.
Okay, thank you. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce the appellate panel to the presenters. We have Mr. Raleigh King, represents the 6th Congressional District. Mr. Jackie Queen represents the 5th Congressional District. Mr. Bob Davis represents the 4th Congressional District. Mr. Andy Twido represents the 3rd Congressional District. Mr. Otis Rawl represents the 2nd Congressional District. And I'm Bill McCall, represent the 1st Congressional District. Before we begin, I'm going to read the following statement. In accordance with the Freedom of Information Act, the High School League posted and provided notices of this hearing and the stated agenda. A copy of the notice will be attached to the minutes of the meeting. Pursuant to South Carolina Code Section 30-4-60, every meeting of all public bodies shall be open to the public unless one of the criteria delineated in the South Carolina Code 30-4-70 is at issue, stating unless the facts and evidence presented in this appeal involve any discussion of employment, appointment, compensation, promotion, demotion, or release of an employee, a student or person regulated by a public body, or the appointment of a person to a public office, this hearing shall proceed in public view of those in attendance at this public hearing. So at this time, do you wish to proceed in an open or closed session?
We wish to go into closed session due to the privacy issues with the student and parent.
Okay. So before the proceeding, I need to ask if you're seeking an interpretation of the legal.
Mr. McCall, we need to take a vote to make sure that the panel votes to go into closed session.
Okay, we need to do that before we, okay. All right, so we get a roll call right now. We go into closed session. Amy, can we get a roll call on that?
Mr. McCall,
Yep, yes.
Mr. Rawl,
No.
Mr. Twido,
No.
Mr. Davis,
No.
Mr. Queen,
No.
Mr. King.
No.
Okay, I have 1 in favor and 5 opposed.
All right, so we're gonna stay in open session.
Mr. McCall, you might want to, I may need to give you some legal advice on that if y'all would be willing to, at least for the purposes of whether or not to go into closed or open session, there may be some legal rights of concern that the panel needs to be aware of.
Okay. Do we need to go into executive session?
I think there needs to be a motion if anybody wishes to hear the legal advice on that.
Do we have a motion to go into executive session to get legal advice?
I make a
I'll
motion.
make that motion.
In a second.
All right. So we got a motion and a second to go into executive session. Can we get a roll call on that, Amy?
Yes, Mr. McCall,
Yes.
Mr. Rawl,
Yes.
Mr. Twido,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mr. Queen,
Yes.
Mr. King.
Yes.
All 6 are in favor.
All right. So we are in executive session.
Not yet. She's gonna move
Yeah.
it.
Hey, Bill, are you there?
When everybody's back in.
Yes, Fred Crawford.
Amy, can you make another roll call? Make sure everybody's back.
Yes, sir. Bill McCall,
Here.
Otis Rawl,
Here.
Andy Twido,
don't see Andy.
Okay, Bob Davis,
Here.
Jackie Queen,
Here.
and Riley King. I'm not seeing Riley King.
Here, I see Raleigh now.
Yes.
Okay. And Andy Twido.
Here.
All right, we're out of executive session. No action was taken. Back to
Mr. Chair,
the closed session.
Mr.
Go ahead.
Chair, based on the information we received by council in executive session, I'd like to reconsider the vote where we voted to hold this hearing in open session.
Okay, we have a motion to hold the meeting in closed session. Do I have a second?
I second it.
All right. We get a roll call, Amy?
Yes, sir. Mr. McCall,
Yes.
Mr. Rawl,
Yes?
Mr. Twido,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mr. Queen,
Yes.
Mr. King.
Yes.
We have 6 in favor of closed session.
So we're in closed session. Thank you, Amy.
Give us just a minute to shut down the Facebook Live before you.
Fine. Let me know when y'all ready.